Hi, welcome to Fiberchats. My name is Irina, I'm the host here, and my guest today is Kelly Vaughn. Hi, Kelly.
Hi, Irina.
So you are the person behind the Knitswag,
Yes.
and I love my cap. I like.
Oh,
So
I'm so glad that you like it.
I use it all the time. It's like my favorite thing.
Awesome.
So how did you get into the Knitswag? Let's start from there.
Sure. Well, I've been a graphic designer and in the publishing industry for probably about 20 years. And most of my work has been kind of in the technical sphere of things, not so much in the artistic realm. But last December, I think it was actually December 2019, the whole idea of ugly Christmas sweaters really became popular.
Right.
And, kind of in like mainstream culture, and you'd see knitted style designs on all sorts of products. But what I was a little bit irked by them because you could tell that a knitter had not designed them. Like they got the details wrong a lot of times. Like there was only maybe half of a stitch, or they would do the stitches in like like a cross instead of like an actual knit stitch, or there was things that weren't quite right. And I thought, I could do it better. I could do knitting designs that were actually like real and authentic, and you could tell they were designed by a knitter because they'd get the details right. The knit stitches wouldn't be like stick shaped. They'd actually be, kind of, individual legs of a stitch, and you could see that the details were correct. As a knitter, that's really important to me. But as a graphic designer, I knew how to illustrate that in my illustration program. Like I actually knew how to make that possible. And so I decided to properly illustrate knitting in a way that other knitters would appreciate it. And that's how Knitswag was started.
So you don't just do little cups. I mean, cups are like amazing, but you didn't stop there. You take
Right.
like the sky is the limit. So I saw that gorgeous suitcase that I'm like,
Yes.
I was like drooling over. And the entire surface of it was like covered with knitting, this Fair Isle knitting.
Uh-huh.
Do
Yes.
you
Yes.
gravitate toward Fair Isle like usually in your designs?
I do. And that's because the beauty of Fair Isle is that it can be just like you in regular knitting. Fair Isle is the way that people used to personalize things, like with Christmas stockings, and you can use letters and you can have really interesting, intricate designs in Fair Isle. And it's the same way with illustration. Like, I guess technically you could, write your name in garter stitch and knitting, but it would be a lot harder and a lot less effective. And I like the Fair Isle designs because honestly, people love personalized stuff. That's why I sell so many of these mugs, because people love having their name on stuff, especially if it's actually done in knitting stitches.
Right.
And so that's the reason that most of my stuff is for Fair Isle type designs. But I do have some other designs. I've got some garter stitch style designs and other things as well.
Well, let's like pedal back a bit, right?
Yeah.
So let's talk about how you got into knitting. You were like really young, right, when you started?
Yes. Yes. I started crocheting at age 8, and my grandmother taught me how to knit at age 11, and she probably gave me, I don't know, 30 or 45 minutes of instruction. However, long the attention span is of an 11-year-old, that's probably about how much I got. She taught me long tail cast on, and she taught me plain knitting. And so I just did garter stitch for, a while, until at some point on my own, I figured out that if you manipulate the stitch differently, going the other direction, you could get like two different sides. You could get like the purl side, and you could get the knit side. So you could get both. And so for a long time, I just worked with whatever books that other members of the family had passed down to me. So I think most of my my books, there might have been like 2 or 3 of them, were like 1970s poncho patterns, because that's all that my family had given to me. But yes, I've been knitting since I was a very young girl, and then I really kind of ramped it up when I was in college.
Right. Well, talking of your family, like were they prolific knitters? Were they knitting all the time, or it was like
No,
occasional?
no, I was in my family, so it was myself, my mom, and my sister. That was our household. I was the only one that did anything like that. Anything yarn related. On my maternal grandmother, she wasn't crafty at all. Like if she broke up a hot glue gun, that was like, wow, grandma's really going for it. On my paternal side, my dad's side, my grandma was pretty prolific as far as the like she would sew and she would crochet and she would knit, but I didn't see her all that often, maybe a couple of times a year, a few times a year. And so it wasn't like she was other than teaching me how to knit that first time, which was awesome, it wasn't like I had this ongoing daily influence from anyone older than me, like encouraging me or instructing me or anything like that.
Right.
It was all me. And sometimes when I was naughty, my mother, her form of punishment was taking away my yarn, and it was devastating.
Would that be devastating now? Like if somebody took away all your yarn, would that feel like a punishment?
I don't know what I would do. I'm a really tactile person, and so I always have to be doing something with my hands, and if I don't have knitting to be productive with, I would it would be very, very difficult for me to not have that form of something to do. Like I would, if I didn't knit, I'd probably be one of those people that had like the fidget toy or the fidget spinner. But to me, you know, like I'd much rather be doing something useful with my hands than just playing with a toy that doesn't make anything warm.
Right. Well, when you knit, right, what do you gravitate towards? Like, do you go for easy patterns or do you go for something that's like challenges you intellectually?
Well, it used to be like when I was in college, I had a lot of, I still didn't know about a lot of techniques. And so I remember checking out Principles of Knitting from the library, and it was amazing. And there was, you know, so many complicated patterns in there. I mean, the book is like this thick, it's just massive. And it, you know, teaches, it's got like, I don't know, 800 pages of technique or something. And so I chose some of the most challenging lace patterns out of there to knit. And at the time, I had, I think, a lot more like brain space, like mental reserve, than I do, you know, now in my 40s. And so I used to knit the really complicated stuff just to see if I could. Like I tried double knitting and I tried lace and I tried, you know, sweaters with set-in sleeves, which I know a lot of people do, and it's like not a big deal. But like for me, I wanted to try all these complicated things just to see if I liked it. And then it turns out what ended up working for me in like the kind of lifestyle that I have and the kind of technical, because I do technical work every day. I do owner's manuals, operating manuals, and it's very, very technical. And so at the end of the day, I don't really want to sit down and like work from a charted brioche pattern or a charted lace pattern. There's just like there's not enough mental reserve for that. Like I use my knitting as a way to wind down from a day of like really intense concentration. And so these days I do almost exclusively garter stitch.
Full circle, basically. It's like you're back.
Yeah.
Well,
Yes.
talking about these days, so you're working also on this book from 1950s?
Yeah, from 1952. Mm-hmm.
So how did that start?
Oh gosh, this book, I learned about it again while I was in college. And back in the day, there was more like hard copy magazines at Barnes and Noble and the bookstores and that sort of thing. And I remember seeing an article, it was in Knitters magazine, and Meg Swanson had wrote an article, and she mentioned this book that was based on a patented hand knitting method. And the word patented was on italics, and I thought that's really interesting. Like, how can you actually patent like something, an action that you do with your hands? But back in the 50s, actually back in 1946, this woman, Virginia Woods Bellamy, she was able to, she submitted a patent application, and then I think in 1948 she got it approved. And the whole idea is that it's modular knitting, and it's based on knitting one unit at a time. And she had 7 different units that she worked from. There's squares, triangles, rectangles, mitered squares, parallelograms. And so you can actually design all of your designs. You can just like chart them out on graph paper and come up with really interesting designs just, you know, on your own based on graph paper. And so she taught this course. She got several patterns published in, like, you know, the women's magazines of the day, like Women's Home Companion and that type of thing. And then one of the editors at one of those magazines said, hey, you should patent this. And so she went forward with the patent application. But at the same time, she taught this method via a correspondence course to knitters literally around the world. And the whole concept behind it is that when you knit in garter stitch, you know, there's all those, there's ridges, and so those hold warmth. But because there's, it's an inherently warm fabric, you can do it on much larger needles and use a lot less yarn. And when she was raising her kids back in the 30s, being able to clothe them for less money was a really big deal. And then, you know, into the 40s with all the rationing and that sort of thing, you know, a lot of yarn being used for, you know, to make socks and sweaters and things for the war effort, that the ability to actually clothe your own kids for less money using simple, you know, modular shapes, that was a really, really big deal. And it was a big hit with knitters of her day. And so what she did after her correspondence course, she compiled all of those lessons into this number knitting book. It was a 6-part correspondence course, and it starts out at the beginning, like, what is number knitting, and then what are the different shapes. And so she takes you through a whole series of lessons, and then at the end you will have, you know, learned how to knit. And so it's really different than a lot of patterns we are accustomed to today, where it, like, you buy, you know, a pattern for $5 or $8 or whatever, and you get everything that you need to know, you know, all in one shot. But in this book, the information is kind of sprinkled throughout. And so it's a very different book than a lot of modern knitting books, because of the fact that it was designed to be a correspondence course that you'd progress it through over the course of many months.
So what's your idea of, like, what are you trying to achieve with this book?
Originally, when I started working on this project, I think it was about 6 years ago, my intention was to just redraw all the charts and the graphs, because the whole thing is based on graph paper. And my intention was to redraw them all to make them easier to see. Now you can see, this is one of the charts.
Right.
It's difficult to see all the details. And I thought originally, I'll just redraw the charts, make it easier to read. And I did that. But then as I was going through the process, I realized, oh, some of the charts are wrong a little bit. And some of the instructions, they have like errors in them. And like this writing is kind of, it's a little bit terse. Like it needs a little bit more explanation for modern knitters. And so originally my intent was just to like republish it in its original form. But then as I'm working through this process over the last 6 years, I'm realizing, oh, like it needs
Work.
You know, more, it needs more work, which I feel like that's probably why no one else has ever republished it, because there has been, you know, interest over the years, you know, among some pretty well-known knitters to republish this work, but to just scan it in is one thing, but then to actually like, you know, make it better, to really elevate it, that's a whole nother level of work, which actually is what I'm going through now. There's 74 patterns in the book, and I'm knitting them one by one, and I'm getting test knitters involved in helping me too, making notes, making instructions, making corrections. Like some of the sweaters in the back of the book, like this one is an example. It's designed on the bias. And so you can't just easily add a couple of stitch count or even calculate your stitch count if you want to have a different size. I think this sweater in the book had one size.
Right.
And if you're not like that one size, like, so sorry, you know, like what if you need a sweater in a size 44? No sweater for you. And so I've also worked on expanding the size range of all the bias design sweaters, like with basically an Excel spreadsheet that will calculate, you know, the Pythagorean theorem, like, you know, the size of your square, then it'll calculate the diagonal for you. And, you know, it'll calculate the stitch count for your sweater size and your gauge.
Right. So I
So
saw like one of the things you posted from that book, there was like this sweater or tank top, I can't remember, but there was like this big opening in the front. And
yeah,
I knitted it by the pattern, and it's like goes down to my navel. So like nobody can wear that. Like, did you
right.
cover a lot of things like that?
Yeah, I did. It's interesting. Like this sweater, for example, I'm standing up. I might get out of the frame just a little bit. This is that sweater. This is one of the sweaters that I've found that problem with. This is how it originally fit.
Right. It was like,
right?
Yeah.
Right. But as a woman in my 40s, I wouldn't go out like that. Not unless I was on vacation somewhere, but I'm not going to go out in public with a belly shirt on. But what was interesting is that the author had hired a very famous fashion photographer to do some of the photographs for the book. Like this picture in the front is like pretty glamorous, right? This is one of the photos that was done by that famous 1950s fashion photographer. And you can tell some of the garments that didn't fit quite right, he just styled them in a way that you couldn't, it would just like cover up what was wrong. And so if I have this belly shirt on, but then I wear a skirt up to here, you don't even know that it's a crop top. And so working through these patterns, I'm finding, I understand why it was photographed flat now, or I understand why the model was only showing the backside, or why she was like hunched over wearing a cape. And I think because that's what the photographer needed to do in order to like kind of cover up the things that didn't fit quite right. But there's a lot of things about these sweaters that do fit amazing because it's modular garter stitch, right? And so there's knitting that goes at different angles. And so it's got this cross waist stretch, and it will just totally hug the curves and fit a huge variety of body types. And these garments are just, they're amazing.
So do you have a prediction of like, or like, I'll rephrase it. When you started working on this book, did you have a prediction of how long it might take you? And do you have that prediction now of how long it might take you?
Yeah, when I started, I thought I'd be done in a year. Well, it's been 6 years.
Right.
And granted, I have a regular full-time job that I do. And so this is something like that I'm working on like as a side project. But I've determined that rather than trying to republish the book in its entirety, because it's 274 pages long and the writing is very brief. And so if I was to expand the writing and, offer more sizes, those 74 patterns could easily, without any problem whatsoever, jump to 600 pages. And that's not really realistic. And so what I've decided to do instead is release the patterns individually, and so that more people can have access to them. And I've started doing that already. But I think what I'm also going to do is I have a lot of my own ideas. I'm going to start developing my own number knitting patterns using those techniques that are outlined in the book, but kind of with my my own creativity.
Right. Do you have a favorite design from that book?
Oh gosh, I love them so much, but I do have one in particular that I'm very fond of. This is actually a free pattern. It's called Lambs and Butterflies, and the reason it's free is because this is the Afghan that was used on her patent application.
I love it.
And what's interesting about it is it's based on mitered squares, and there's lots of mitered square blankets out there, but a lot of times what happens is the diagonals all go in one direction. And a lot of times people use them as like memory blankets or strappy yarn blankets, and so they're like all crazy colors. This one is very thoughtful, and the lines don't all go in one direction. And so it starts out, if you're familiar with a 10 stitch blanket, are you familiar with a 10 stitch blanket?
Well, do
So,
tell us, like
okay,
a wider
yeah.
audience.
So it's a really popular style of blanket. There's free patterns on Ravelry. You cast on 10 stitches and you knit and garter stitch, and you basically knit around and around and round and round with mitered edges. So the whole thing is just based on a single strip, 10 stitches wide. Well, this blanket does that same, it's that same concentric design,
Right.
except instead of 10 stitches, straight up and down, you're knitting a mitered square. So you do one mitered square and then you pick up and you knit the next mitered square. And so you're knitting mitered squares around, which is really interesting because what that allows you to do is incorporate diagonals into your design. Right. And you can knit pictures. And that's what she did in her patent application, which she got some graph paper, she drew out these different shapes of the lambs and the butterflies, but she didn't knit them like from the bottom up. She knit them round and round, which is it's really interesting. I've never seen any other knitted blankets that do that, knit mitered squares in the round. And so I think the fact that she not just did that, but then incorporated pictures into it, actually just the one, this lambs and butterflies blanket is the only pattern that she produced like that. But the fact that she combined the mitered squares with concentric knitting and pictures is like, wow, it's amazing. It's super fun.
I mean, honestly, like when I'm listening to you, I'm thinking dissertation for PhD. Like, have you ever considered that?
I actually have. Yes, I reached out to a couple of schools, and it didn't really go anywhere. But I have a good friend actually that earned her PhD from Cornell, and she's like, "Have you ever thought about getting a PhD
I'm not the only one who is thinking
from
that.
Cornell?" Yeah, and there is another lady that I know on Instagram, Dr. Lily Marsh, and she is a weaver in upstate New York, and she actually did her PhD on Elizabeth Zimmerman and her knitting and how she elevated her craft from knitting to fine art. And she worked on that for I think 5 years and got a PhD in that subject. So yes, the thought has crossed my mind. I would love to do that, but I only have a finite number of hours in each day. So
well, let's talk about that. How do you decide what you're working on? What takes priority?
The things that pay the bills, to be honest. And so I have a pretty steady workload of my normal publishing work and technical manuals. And so within that schedule, I have to I do Knitswag, and if someone orders a mug, mugs are what I sell the most of. If someone orders a mug or a wine tumbler, I'll work that in. That's fairly quick for me to produce. But as far as the actual documentation of like redrawing the patterns from number knitting and tech editing them and working on the writing and drafting new designs, that comes kind of like lower on the priority scale as far as when I'm able to dedicate time to it. And I know that's why I'm 6 years later I'm still working on this project, but I'm definitely still working on it every single day. Almost all the items that I knit are patterns from number knitting, from the number knitting book, because I want to knit all 74. They're all in there for a reason, and I want to knit them all so that every little nugget of knowledge or technique that is presented for each pattern, I want to absorb that and understand it. And it's one thing to format the text and to redraw the chart, but until you go to knit it, you're not going to grasp all the information. And so I feel like knitting all those patterns, even if it's in my off hours, at night when I'm winding down, or like in the morning when I'm having my coffee, that going through knitting those patterns is that's like my graduate study as far as getting the knowledge. But I have to do that sort of like bookends at the end of the day.
So where are you now? Like in the 74 numbers, where are you?
I think I'm probably right around 40 at this point that I've knit. And this is one of the first the first sweaters I knit early on.
I love that.
And it's called Hampton sweater. There's a couple of sweaters in there designed for men, and this was one of them. And I mean, it fits me great. So it doesn't necessarily have to be just for a man. But what's interesting about this is see how the diagonals go in different directions?
Right.
She calls this ski tracks design. And a lot of the other sweaters, they use gauge shifting. Are you familiar with that term? So gauge shifting uses different needle sizes to adjust for shaping in the garment. And so normally if you have a body, you cast on so many stitches for the body, and then you work up, you might work in like reduce your number of stitches for the waist and then increase your number of stitches for the bust line. And so the stitch count is always changing. Well, with this method of knitting, the stitch count doesn't change in each individual unit. Like if you're knitting a square, you're going to knit the same number of stitches each time. What she has you do instead is change your needle size. So if I start knitting this and the bottom I'm knitting, well, this uses the same needle size the whole way around, but let's do this one. This is, you see how it kind of flares out a little bit at the hips and kind of tucks in a little bit at the waist?
Mm-hmm.
That's because those waistline units use a different needle size. And so she'll have you use larger needles at the waist, smaller needles at the hips, smaller needles at the waist, larger for the bust. And you can even like a lot of sweaters may be a little gappy right here. And so you can knit these like little side units here on tighter needles to kind of bring that fabric in, and then use larger needles again for the shoulders, and then progressively smaller down toward the wrists. And so the shaping that you can do with needle size is just, it's phenomenal. And I think what's interesting is I haven't seen that method in any other modern knitters. And she actually, by she, I mean the author, Virginia Woods Bellamy, at the very beginning of her book, she mentions Mary Thomas. The Mary Thomas knitting books, she said, are some of the most interesting being published today. And they were published in the 30s. But there's a section in there where Mary Thomas says that if you change, if you decrease your needle size by going down 1, you can effectively change your stitch gauge by about 1/2 stitch per inch.
Right.
And so by changing your needle size, you can adjust for fit. And this is mentioned in like a 1938 book. And I feel like Bellamy is
not that like, popularized, like it makes so much sense.
It does, but I've never seen it used anywhere else except for number knitting, where Bellamy uses it in all of her women's sweaters, the gauge shifting.
That's so interesting. Well, let's switch a little bit towards your Knitswag business.
Sure.
What do you sell the most? Like, is it mugs like that sell the most?
Yes, mugs sell the most. The traditional Scandinavian style mugs, personalized, they sell the most. Like this one. This is my best seller. I have it in, I don't know, like 10 different colorways, but I can make whatever color that people want. And
so when
also
people
this
come
one
to your website, right? Do they have the choice of design, the choice of name? Like, how can they personalize it?
Each different design is a different listing, and I think I've got probably about, I don't know, 40 different mug designs, plus tumblers, and some of those designs are available on different products, but they've got about 40 different ones to choose from. And then within each one, there's different colors. I think this one comes in 4 different colorways. And so, yeah, they can just peruse the designs and then personalize them from there. In my website, I actually have a way to classify them even better. Like I have different categories for whimsical or animals or, traditional. And so if someone's looking for a particular kind of a style, they can choose that style, and just those particular mugs within that category will show for them.
Right. So did you, like, when you decided to get into that business, did you have it all thought out, planned out? Like, did you have the marketing plan, how you're gonna do it?
No, I honestly, I kind of did it. I started it out, I wouldn't say on a whim, but I didn't really realize like how big it was going to be. As far as the interest of people, like I personally knew that knitters would like it because I'm a knitter and I know what other knitters like, but I didn't envision how many products that I would offer. This is my first time creating designs for print on demand. I worked in the printing industry for a long time, and so I'm really comfortable with file prep and file formats and artwork creation. That's like, you know, that's I could do that in my sleep. But as far as the print on demand and the marketing and trying to get my designs in front of actual knitters, that was all a rather steep learning curve.
So how was it, like, what was that journey like?
Well, it started out just by, I watched some YouTube videos about Etsy keywording, you know, which was helpful. That was really important for me. But I knew that I needed to have more than just Etsy keywording. Like I needed to physically get these products into the hands of and in front of people that maybe weren't necessarily looking for knitting mug on Etsy. And one of the videos I watched said her most successful method of promoting her products was sending them to YouTubers and to social media influencers. And if they like it and post about it, great. And if not, you know, no big deal. They got a nice gift. And so I started reaching out to the YouTubers that I really liked and whose videos I really appreciated. And I just started offering them free mugs. And a lot of them said, yeah, I love a free mug. And they'd, you know, show it off on their channel.
No? Did anyone said no?
Yeah, there was one person that said no. I've had some people like not answer, and maybe it got lost in their Instagram messages. But most people have said yes. I'm better now at choosing the right people to contact. Like early on, I contacted someone, a knitting instructor. She had like 695,000 YouTube followers. And
subscribers.
So that didn't go anywhere, right? But I find that the people that are more like down to earth, you know, with their business, they're not like up in the stratosphere, and you know, they're more kind of starting out. Like I'm, you know, I still feel like I'm, you know, 2 years in, I'm kind of starting out in this business. People that are kind of at the same level as me, they're much more likely, and they're much more interested to, you know, see what I've got and to showcase it on their podcasts.
Right. What's Instagram like for you? Like, is that sort of inspiration? Is it sort of like place to meet new people? Like, how do you use Instagram?
I use Instagram for mostly inspiration. I wish, honestly, I was better at using it for, you know, for posting regularly. But I mostly use it at this point for inspiration and to get ideas for new designs and just to see what other knitters are working on. Yes, but I have figured out a way to set it up so that I can connect my shop with it and actually tag products. And so that's been pretty exciting. That was a learning curve for sure.
So Kelly has for the viewers of our channel, right? So she designed this mug with my name, but she designed the same exact mug with Fiberchats on it. And we actually had a giveaway, and Steven Weber, who was one of my guests actually of my channel, won that mug. And he loves it. He's like, he posted it and he's using it all the time. So for the viewers of this interview, Kelly is offering 15% off of all the merchandise that you can find in Knitswag. And also, if you want to order this particular mug with the 2 squares on it, that would say Fiberchats, that would be at 20% off. And you can find those discount codes in the description of this video.
Yes.
Thank you. Let's talk about the COVID. So you basically started in 2019 and then COVID hit. So how did that help or hurt your business?
You know, it's hard to say because my business is kind of really only been in existence as, during the duration of COVID. And so I do know that from like a production standpoint, there have been some supply chain issues that have affected the vendors and the suppliers that I work with, like those suitcases, for example. They sadly, they were up and available for like a month, and then they were all sold out. I'm pretty sure all the blank ready to print suitcases are like waiting in a cargo ship off of the coast of Long Beach right now, because they're out of stock, sadly. But for the most part, as far as my business, I think it's actually, it's probably had a beneficial effect. If that sounds kind of hard, because COVID has been devastating. But what happened with COVID is that suddenly people that used to drive to the office every day and take their kids to school every day and had like all these outside of the home things to do were suddenly inside of their home. And so you saw all kinds of new knitting podcasts pop up in 2020, and a whole bunch more creators that weren't in the space before that suddenly had all this time at home to do knitting related things. And so for that reason, I've been able to partner with a lot of those kind of like up and coming YouTube knitting content creators, and they've showed off my designs and gotten them in front of the eyes of a lot of people. And so I think just because of the fact that a lot more people were spending a lot more time on YouTube, that's been beneficial for Knitswag.
Right. So what's your plan for next year? Like, where do you see this business going?
Well, it's I'm definitely going to still keep producing more designs. I put in a lot of work in 2020 and 2021, coming up with dozens of designs that would fit with a variety of types of knitters and people. What I'm doing now is spending a little bit less time on the knitting designs, because I do have so many of mug designs, and I've been spending more time on the number knitting book, and actually working through those patterns and editing them. And I'm in the process of developing more of my own that are going to be released in 2022. It's been coming up fast, but that's the plan, is to have, while I do the mugs, the mug sales really they fund the number knitting effort, and so they're not necessarily like super tightly related, but they complement each other well, and that one brings in money and the other is a labor of love that I'd like to bring to knitters around the world, and to really educate people on this method, and to bring the book and forward, and make the concepts behind it available for modern knitters. But I've also, I digitized the entire thing, and I have that available on my for sale on my website. If anyone wants the original, unedited, like the original 1952 version, I have that available as well.
Right. So when you need those samples, right, from the book, do you pick the same colors that's in the pictures?
Well, the pictures are all in black and white, and so I try to. Sometimes she describes the colors like dusty rose, or pale blue, or dove blue, and so I've tried to colorize I've gone through and I've colorized many of the photos in Photoshop, and those are in the digital edition I have for sale. But when I knit the samples, I do try to use a similar color, like this shawl, for example. The name of this pattern is called Gold Butterfly Shawl, which isn't very descriptive, and she didn't like specify use this yarn brand and this color. She just called it gold and fingering weight yarn, and so I've tried to when possible use those same color combinations, but not always. But I really want to recreate them as faithfully as possible.
But then when you do your own designs, do you try to stick to the same like 1950s sort of color palette, or you becoming unstoppable?
I have tried to stick with a similar color palette. Like this sweater, for example, isn't 1950s style yarn. It's, you know, it's got these little bumps in it, but it's all one color, which is unusual for modular knitting. Usually modular knitting is like, you know, each unit is a different color. And so when you wear it, it's like,
Right.
wow, that's hand knit, isn't it? And so I've tried to stick with colors that are more, they're more reflective of the 1950s kind of aesthetic.
When you need stuff that's not your patterns, right, or not from this book, do you gravitate over different colors, or is that your aesthetic as well?
That is also my aesthetic. I like things that are kind of like, you know, either one color or maybe two colors, max 3 colors. But if I go beyond that, you know, they're always going to be kind of like, you know, in the same section of the color wheel, and like harmonious, because that's just what I like. And sometimes maybe I'll add a little pop of color, but I tend to like things that are a little bit more like classic, understated. And so the beauty, the amazing part of the knitting isn't necessarily because of like the crazy outlandish, like I would never do neon green. I like to let the stitch definition and the lines of the knitting itself really be the showcase of the design, and the yarn is like the delivery method for that.
Do you have a favorite like yarn base?
Ooh, I do like merino wool. Like who doesn't like merino wool? I have to say I am partial to 2-ply fingering. I like non-superwash, and the reason for that is, you know, superwash is great because you can throw it in the washing machine and like not ruin it.
Right.
But I like non-superwash because I find that when you, like, I could knit something with superwash, and then after I wash it, it's like, and it's just got like this droopy effect. And so you really have to be rather careful about your gauge. And I'm kind of like a freestyle knitter, and so I just kind of spitball it on my gauge generally, and I'm generally right. Not always, but with the non-superwash, it's just got a little bit more grip to it, and it's gonna stay more in the size that it was when I knitted it, rather than with superwash that just kind of like it stretches more than I would prefer.
Right. Well, with that like free-spirited gauging, have there been any surprises?
Yeah. So this little number.
By little
This
number,
is
you mean little number.
yeah, this is 11 inches wide, right? And it's knit with superwash yarn. And granted, I was on a road trip when I cast this on, and I didn't do an adequate gauge swatch, and I didn't use the gauge specified in the pattern. And so, and I was on a road trip, and I had like, you know, 4 sizes of needles with me. And so I didn't have like my full tool set. And, you know, so we're driving, you know, we got like 4 days of driving in Oregon, and this is the project that I had to work with. And I didn't have any other yarn with me, and I only had a few needle sizes, but I was like determined to knit it. And so I knit it. And after I sewed it up, I was like, oh my gosh, that is so small. You know, the funny thing is it fits. It fits. It's a belly shirt. It comes up above my navel, but no joke. Look at how stretchy this is.
Wow.
And it just stretches right back into shape. This is the beauty of modular garter stitch, is it's got this crossway tension. And that's even the title of the book. Number knitting, the new all-way stretch method. And so it stretches because the knitting is going in different directions.
Right.
And so it's always going to want to like pull itself back into shape. And so you could knit a really big blanket or a really big shawl or stole or whatever in modular units, and you could just like hang it up forever, and it's never going to stretch out. As soon as you take it down, it's just like, oh, okay, back to place. But this is the one where, as a freestyle knitter, I got bit a little bit because I didn't gauge swatch sufficiently.
Right. Well, when I didn't gauge the first time, my blanket that I was knitted ended up being like 13 feet long. So it's better to go on like half a size smaller, I guess.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I was knitting a blanket for my youngest and ended up like it was long enough to cover all 3 of my children. So it's like one of those heirloom pieces. Yeah, this is like the lesson of the decade, swatch.
Right. Yeah, it uses like 8 pounds of yarn.
Right. Well, I'm so glad we got to chat today, because it's really interesting what you do, and I love your business, and I think it makes amazing gifts. So guys, if you need something for Christmas, highly recommend it. Love my cap, get your own. And thank you for being my guest today.
Yes, thanks for having me, Irina.
Thank you.